Keys to the Shop, episode 175, How to Keep Your Cool, with Luke Peterson of the Maintenance Department. Hey everybody, and welcome to another episode of Keys to the Shop, where we give you insights, inspiration, and the tools you need to grow as a coffee service professional. My name is Chris DeFurio. I'm your host for the show, and of course, I'm always happy to have you along today. A very practical episode today, and one that I am really excited about because it's so practical, and it will save you money, it will save you time. It is all about taking care of that refrigeration equipment in your store. So I'm excited to talk with our guest, Luke Peterson, today about this. And I want to mention, if you have not yet subscribed to Keys to the Shop, I would encourage you to hit the subscribe button, and that way every time a new episode is uploaded, it will pop up on your phone and you will not miss anything. And if you have the opportunity to rate or review this show on iTunes, that would be much appreciated as well. And lastly, I want to mention that if you want the bonus audio from this episode, then go ahead and sign up for the Keys to the Shop newsletter over at keystotheshop.com. In that newsletter, you're going to receive the transcripts of the episodes, as well as the bonus audio and other resources to help you grow as a coffee professional. So head on over to keystotheshop.com and sign up for that today. Now, this episode today is brought to you by the folks that not only sell amazing coffee equipment, but also excellent refrigeration equipment, and that is Prima Coffee. They are one of the world's best specialty coffee equipment suppliers, and what they do is they curate the best equipment from around the world, and then they fit it perfectly with the needs of their customers. So when you work with Prima Coffee, their goal is to help you find the right equipment for whatever your situation may be. You know, you may be opening a new shop, or you might already have a store, but you're thinking about upgrading the equipment that you've got, or you're wanting to outfit a second location, which congratulations, and I think that Prima Coffee is a perfect choice to help you outfit that new location. Go to their website, prima-coffee.com, and see what I'm talking about. You're going to see an amazing assortment of quality equipment, and you're also going to see a lot of resources that they have put on their website for free to help you know how to use the equipment properly from the word go. And that's something they do because helping you succeed in making great coffee is what drives them. So go to prima-coffee.com. Let them know that you heard about them through Keys to the Shop. And a huge thank you to Prima for their support of Keys to the Shop. This episode is also brought to you by the Pacific Barista Series. This is the line of plant-based performance beverages that are designed specifically for and by professional baristas and the standards for excellence that they demand. So when you're working with the Barista Series, you could be using their almond, soy, oat, rice, or coconut milk. No matter what you choose, the ability for the Barista Series to take the heat from the steaming process, produce amazing latte art ready texture, and keep the flavor balance of your beverage focused on coffee. All of these and more make it a perfect choice for your cafe's menu. Pacific has been a huge supporter of the specialty coffee industry and specifically the barista culture and community, and these products are just a testimony to that fact. I would highly encourage you to get them in your store and try them out for yourself and see how they can elevate the non-dairy offerings in your shop. Go to pacificfoods.com to learn more. Thank you so much, Pacific, for your support of Keys to the Shop. Okay, well, today we're going to be talking about something that I don't know that I've ever heard on a coffee podcast before, which is a discussion about refrigeration equipment. And these are kind of the forgotten pieces of equipment in our cafe, like I said in the beginning here, until they break, and then everything grinds to a halt. Baristas are calling managers, managers are calling owners, owners are calling landlords, and it's just back and forth, and it's days sometimes before anything gets resolved. And you might have just gone through this. You might just be in the middle of it right now. And, you know, the kicker is that a lot of it is unnecessary, that we don't actually have to go through as much as we do when it comes to the equipment. If we just knew a little bit more about the equipment, proper installation, proper usage, and preventative maintenance, then a lot of the money that we spend and the stress that we have in the shop around the display case or the ice machine or the refrigeration in general could be avoided. And so that is why I have brought on my friend and master refrigeration technician, Luke Peterson of the maintenance department. Now, I've known Luke for a while now. I met him when I was working operations for Sunnergoss Coffee here in Louisville, and he was working for a larger refrigeration company at the time. And he has been working in the commercial refrigeration space for over 10 years. Now in business for himself with his company, the maintenance department. He is just a wealth of knowledge and always has great barside manner when it comes to, coming into your cafe, fixing the equipment. And as you're going to find out, is free with this information, and it wants to help you and me avoid having to call him. He is a very generous guy with a lot to share. And in this conversation, we are going to cover quite a bit. It's a technical conversation. We're talking about things like why your milk freezes, best practices for ice machines, display cases and coolers, under-counter refrigeration, the ideal humidity for your equipment in terms of the ambient humidity of your cafe, preventative maintenance schedules, things that Luke has found in ice machines. It runs the gamut and is very informative. So without further ado from me, let's learn how to keep our cool with Luke Peterson of the maintenance department. All right, Luke, what a pleasure it is to have you on the show.
Well, thank you for having me on. This is an honor and an opportunity I've been waiting for a while.
Yeah, you've seen a lot of different situations over the past 10 years of work in this field. And I've known you since I started working way back in the day at Sunnergoss, and you have your own company now. Back then you were working for somebody else. You have your own company now called the Maintenance Department, and I've always loved calling you and using you for different jobs that have come up in the cafe, and so I really jumped at the chance to sort of stop you in the cafe when I saw you as I was working on an episode, and I thought this is the next episode. It has to be about the thing that we're all experiencing here right now in Louisville, which is just like ice machines are dying and refrigerators and freezers are just on the fritz. Everyone deals with it, and you're the person that I've gone to in the past, and now I think it's perfect to talk to you about this right now. I guess the question I want to start with is, what are the main pieces of equipment that you service the most in a coffee shop environments and more food and beverage establishments? What are the main ones that you get called on for?
Probably the singular piece of equipment that I would probably have given most of my hours to over the last 10 years is probably ice makers. They're in constant demand, and as we'll touch on in a few minutes, they're actually one of the more neglected pieces of equipment that's actually running the hardest of all the refrigeration that's in your local cafe.
Is that they're running the hardest, even though I hear the fridge going, I hear the freezer going, but I guess just because the door is opening and closing all the time like that?
Well, it has more to do with the demand of, particularly in the summer when you're using either doing frozen beverages or iced coffee or you name it. Anytime you pull ice out of that bin, that machine has to produce more ice. Whereas when you pull a carton of milk out of your under bar refrigerator, it doesn't necessarily tell that machine to start running. And so the ice maker is by far the workhorse of the cafe, in my opinion.
Okay.
At least based on my repair logs over the last 10 years.
Yeah, and in environments where it's really hot, and especially it seems like in the summer, that's when you would see the spike in calls for things like that. Is it the same for refrigeration and freezers, or is that just something else?
Couple of things. The refrigeration demand is pretty even at least in the cafe setting, is pretty even throughout the year, because typically these are in controlled environments. You're running the temperature of the store between 68 and 74 degrees, depending on the time of year and the type of HVAC system you have doing a climate control. And so it's actually a fairly steady demand all year round. Obviously, during the winter months, you're not going to go through as much ice, simply because people are ordering warmer beverages, unless you're me, and you always get ice in your coffee because you're a big baby. So
now I put ice in my coffee too sometimes. I'm impatient as I get older. It's okay.
So yeah, but that's typically it's a plateau of repair, or plateau of demand, so to speak, throughout the season. Obviously, in the winter, the temp at the store does go down a little bit. Refrigeration doesn't work as hard, but it's pretty steady.
Do you see kind of an even rate of calls for under-counter fridges as you do for display fridges?
So anything that has glass doors in it, i.e. a display, bakery case, a dual temp or dual zone display case, those typically are going to have a lot more demand on them, simply because a thin piece of glass is a terrible insulator. And on top of it, they run heaters on that glass to keep it from getting foggy. And so they typically have a little larger demand than, say, your under counter or your under bar refrigerator with insulated stainless steel doors.
That makes a lot of sense. And like, is that compounded even more when you have a dual zone display fridge?
Yeah, because typically when you're dealing with a dual zone and it has curved glass, when you have curved glass, you have a lot more heat influx, because anytime light passes through that glass, part of it turns into infrared and just warms everything. And so typically on the dual zone, there is not as much of a problem from, the two temperatures per se, but it's more just due to the fact that there's just a lot of glass and there's a lot of lighting to make that product pop. And obviously in some, I don't see them too often, mostly in stores that have juice bar or something like that. They'll have an open refrigerated cooler. Those are very wasteful on energy and very, very demanding. And those usually have quite a bit of demand. I do have one pizza joint that I take care of, and they've gotten rid of all of or will be getting rid of all of their, what they call grab and go coolers, simply because they're very problematic.
So those air curtain coolers.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah, it does seem like when you look at it, you're thinking, boy, especially when you can see it in the moisture sort of is visible in different temperatures. I can see the actual air curtain coming down, and it seems to me like, boy, this is taking a lot to push air out. And when it gets hotter and hotter, the door opens to the cafe, your HVAC system has to work harder, it gets warmer. It just seems like all of your equipment is going to work harder, because even though you try to control the interior of the store, it's going to fluctuate too. No, it doesn't seem like the interior of your store is going to be a constant temperature.
Yeah. Usually the problem during the summertime isn't as much the heat. Most stores are built pretty well, with the exception of a few I've walked into, are built pretty well with their HVAC system. But the humidity, or the latent heat load that is put on the equipment, especially anything that's open and or glass, is evident basically because you're able to see the sweat. That heat, all of that water is essentially hot water, vapor, and as it condenses, it gives us heat off into that piece of equipment. And so that piece of equipment then has to work to get that out.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, it makes sense to think that these things are designed to work best in dry environments. With dry heat is better than humidity.
Yeah, they typically have, depending on the manufacturer, the recommended humidity level, I think, is no more than 50 to 60%, and they don't want to see that in a store that's over 78 degrees. Otherwise, you will start having performance issues with the piece of equipment.
Wow, I've never really thought about the humidity of the cafe itself contributing to the wear and tear on the refrigeration equipment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a big load. I mean, water carries a lot of energy and a lot of heat energy, and that's why sometimes you go into a store and it feels really muggy. It's not hot, but it feels really muggy, but that store can't get the humidity out of the air enough to make it feel comfortable. So, yeah, those are some psychrometric, they call it, charts that can explain all of the heat load, but that can get pretty technical pretty fast.
Oh, interesting. I mean, we use hot water for coffee, and that's good for coffee. Not good for machines, though.
Right.
So we have all these machines in our stores. We like to think about the coffee equipment mostly when we actually read technical manuals on these things. Most of us, I'd say most of us, but I think owners probably are the more likely candidates. But then other coffee professionals aren't taking the time to read manuals and thumb through the Manitowoc. You think it's a nice machine, it works the way it works. So we have these pieces of equipment: ice machines, under-counter fridges, and display cases. And those are kind of the three that we usually find in a cafe. But oftentimes, I think because we're not really versed in the kind of things maybe we should be versed in, like we do things wrong. We maybe install it wrong, or we take care of it wrong. I wonder, like, thinking about those three things in particular, what kinds of things do you see people do that end up causing a lot of problems down the road where it's preventable and you can see, like, geez, glad for the business that you called me, but had you have done 1, 2, 3, you wouldn't have needed to call me.
Yeah, there's a few things that come to mind in particular. Probably one of the biggest problems as far as self-contained refrigeration goes is putting a piece of equipment in a room that doesn't have adequate ventilation. As the compression or as the refrigeration cycle happens, it always produces more heat, just because, there's no perfect system. And so a room that is too small will actually get very, very hot, even though the refrigerator is just, it's in there, but just the whole process of refrigerating requires a lot of energy, and all that energy turns into heat. So I've seen like a true T23, a stainless front refrigerator put into a closet that was about, it was just barely big enough for the unit, and they had constant problems with it going down, simply not because of airflow issues through the condenser, but heat retained in that room was about 90 degrees. and it was outside the spec. Even though the store had the right spec, that room did not have adequate airflow to keep that piece of equipment operating within spec.
Can we build our bars in such a way to essentially create a closet around our equipment to produce the same effect?
Absolutely. I've seen people really proud of their bars, and you push a piece of equipment back in there, like a TUC 48, which is an under-counter true refrigerator, or something like that, a 2-door refrigerator under the bar, and they push that in there and don't have adequate ventilation. True has done a pretty good job of making it available for air to circulate from the side and from the bottom, but there are other manufacturers who haven't made those exceptions, and the piece of equipment just isn't going to work. I see this more in bars versus coffee shops, but that's pretty common, where they have a really nice tight spot, and then it doesn't get airflow, can't get rid of heat, and it will just make people unhappy.
Right. So we want to look at our plans for a coffee bar. Now, this is obviously relevant for people who are wanting to expand to a new location, and they have their whole punch list of equipment that they're looking at. and they're breaking out the tape measure, and they think, okay, we've got enough room for a double door fridge under the bar right here. Just barely fits. I mean, how much room does a fridge, ideally speaking, how much room does a fridge need under a counter in order for us to avoid unnecessary wear and tear like these tight quarters you were just talking about do?
Yeah, so most of the pieces of equipment have really good diagrams and explanations in their installation manuals. They'll give you pretty much everything that you need to have an adequate clearances on that piece of equipment. The biggest issue I see is where people push a unit back into a small corner, and then it's completely boxed in. And even though it can still vent through the back, it just still circulates the air. And so making sure that there are some opportunities for air to escape in that bar area behind that unit or on the sides of that unit, at least one side or another, is beneficial. And it really does depend on manufacturer and application and what size of equipment you're doing, working with. And so one other thing I would recommend is that some of these worktop refrigerators might be handy, and you might think that's a great place to set the espresso machine. I don't recommend setting that espresso machine on that piece of equipment unless you have significant extra hose behind it, because anytime you work on any of these underbar refrigerators, they have to be pulled all the way out. And oftentimes there wasn't the forethought to give longer hoses, and sometimes you can't give longer hoses and electrical cords to these big pieces of equipment. And those espresso machines are expensive, and really you don't want to be moving those around at all once you get them in place.
Oof.
And so, you get a bad caster, get an old unit, get a bad piece of floor, and pull that thing out, and the whole thing rocks forward, and your technician is now wearing a espresso machine. And can be
wearing the espresso machine is wearing your technician is more like it.
Yeah. Either way, both are in bad shape.
Yeah. I laugh because this is like at least two experiences when working on bars whose primary espresso machine was right on top of the double door, and it seems like such an efficient use of space. And until you got to pull it out, so many of us have that one fridge that is built in like a permanent fixture, and we know there's like 8 different types of silverware and cups and things like that have fallen between the fridge and the front of the bar. We can't pull the fridge out. We can't clean back there because we didn't think through, hey, this thing needs to be serviced every now and again.
Yeah, and that's the other thing that is good to think through when you are setting up a bar in a new location is plan for failure. Not failure of the business, but plan for failure of equipment. And having that equipment being able to be moved in and out easily is going to save a lot of headache down the road. And I know some of these shops are really small and just don't have a lot of real estate to work with. But as much as it can be done, it will save, 5 to 7 years. Like if you start out the store with used equipment, you can expect 5 years out of a piece of used equipment sometimes. And if you get into that situation where that piece of equipment goes bad, you have the money for a new one, you want that swap out to be pretty fluid, and tearing the bar apart isn't fluid.
No. It's a huge hassle. Been there, done that. Of course, you times 100. What else are we missing when it comes to refrigeration that we should be doing? Things we're doing wrong. We know we're cramming it into these tight quarters. We're not giving proper ventilation. There are other things that we're doing that we shouldn't be doing, and what should we do instead?
Let me just talk briefly about probably the biggest maintenance issues that I see on these undercounter and for that matter, the any reach-in equipment I see. Probably the biggest failure is the unit runs warm, and I get there, pull the unit out, and there's a sweater as I like to call it, over the condenser.
Yes.
The condenser, for those of you who don't know, is that thing that looks like a radiator grill, basically has fins on it, and it draws air through it, and that's actually what is rejecting the heat from inside the unit. And so if it can't get that heat out, it can't take the heat out. If it can't push that heat away from the unit, it can't take heat out from inside the unit. And so as that thing gets dirty with lint, I mean, you guys oftentimes have really nice stores and you're sweeping a lot, and every time you sweep, a little bit of that dust finds its way into the condenser, or if you have a grinder, as I've seen a couple of times, and all of that dust from the grinder is, going down, getting sucked into that condenser, that makes for poor airflow. And that's a maintenance issue that has to be done. This is the other reason why it's important to actually, make sure you have proper clearances. Just because you want your service tech, whether the store owner or managers are doing the work on it, or if you have a service company such as myself come in and do the work on it, you want that to be done easily, because in most companies are time and materials, and if they're there 4 hours trying to figure out how they're going to get to your condenser, for something so simple to resolve the not cooling issue, it will be, it just gets expensive. It's costly. And so, so that's the biggest one, a dirty condenser. But the second biggest one is oftentimes you will find that there is just kind of a wetness or dampness inside the unit. Part of a good preventative maintenance program would include making sure the drain lines that are inside the evaporator compartment, inside your cooler, are clear and allow for the water to drain out properly. If it can't drain out, then you get that rancid sour milk smell and various other just slimy, gross looking stuff growing around the edges of your cooler on the inside. And the solution for that, I have found, is people just put a towel in there and squeegee it out, and that's just kind of how they figure it has to remain. Well, it's just wet in there, but that's not the case. It's not supposed to be wet. Commercial refrigeration is technically supposed to be a dry environment because it removes the moisture from the air as it cools. Mm-hmm. And so if you do have a system that is really wet on the inside, the chances of you having a plugged drain line is very high. Those are the two things. The next one that causes wetness in the box is improperly maintained door gaskets. I know the city of Louisville will require you to change your gaskets if they see them torn, because that's a breeding ground for bacteria. But it's also a reason why a lot of refrigeration can't reach temperature, or is always, the inside of it is always really wet. It's because it's always pulling in humid air, and more than it's designed to deal with. So those are probably the big three.
Great. Yeah, that's really helpful, because we definitely just are great adaptation machines. We on bar, there's a lot of things that are just kind of broke. Some things are really broken. When we fix it, we're mm-hmm. proud of it, and we just keep it that way. Mm-hmm. So it becomes like part of the checklist. Put the towels in the fridge and soak up the water. And
right.
Like, that's definitely something I've lived with for a while. As you're speaking, I'm thinking too, like, is there something that we should avoid in terms of what we're putting inside of the fridges? Like, really, sometimes I see there are fridges that are just so crammed full of things. Is that a danger to, do you have to have space for circulation of air in the unit? Can you over cram these fridges?
Yes and no. If you're filling it up with uniform boxes that are all, basically filling it in like a Tetris box, and there's no gaps for air to circulate between the product and along the bottom, your stuff on the bottom can actually be above temperature or along some of the sidewalls. So yes, there can be an instance where your unit that you're working with is quote unquote too full, but it's more along the lines of, as long as you can get airflow around the sides and bottom, you're going to have basically a mass of cold that will work its way as the your product gives off its heat to the colder environment around it, it'll cool. But if you have one problem I've seen is where, and this is in a different scenario than a coffee shop, but we'll take those flats of Cokes and they'll stack them in there and they'll start pulling them out and they'll start thinking, hey, this refrigerator is not cooling because the stuff on the bottom or on the sides has gotten warm.
Right.
And so that's an example of just, the product in the fridge being too uniform, where you can get some basically heat transfer issues.
Is that something that contributes a little bit to where we get like one area that's really cold and it freezes the milk?
Yeah, so in a scenario like that, what likely has happened is there is inadequate airflow to circulate through the whole thing. Now, just about anything that's sitting right at the discharge of the evaporator, basically where the cold air comes out, that air is coming out anywhere from 25 to 19, maybe even 15 degrees with some refrigerators. And so a lot of things that are sitting right next to that discharge of the evaporator, it's likely they'll freeze. I always warn people with open vegetables to kind of keep it more towards the front because it will temper that air a little bit before it hits that leafy vegetable.
Interesting. So like high water content items such as like skim milk or lower fat milks and
yes,
those vegetables, if you put them there, that they might freeze. But if you put them on the other side, maybe just store things like from fat to less fat, moving away from where the air comes out.
Yeah, anything with a high sugar content is safe. Anything with a high fat content is safe. Anything diet needs to be thrown away. But anything like that that has any sort of mostly water-based, very low salt content, those things are going to be more susceptible to that. And there can be adjustments that can be done on the temperature to mitigate some of that freezing. Most manufacturers slow the air down enough and disperse it. Like True especially is pretty good about dispersing the air so that it comes out pretty well tempered within just an inch or two of the evaporator discharge. But there are some that have trouble cooling, and depending on the type and brand of unit, results may vary. That's my disclaimer.
Yes, exactly. Don't go calling Luke. Well, yeah, but do call him,
Just don't call me. Just don't call me a liar.
Yeah, exactly. So we've spent some good amount of time on refrigeration. I think that's one of the main things that we deal with. And of course, as you said in the beginning of our talk here, ice machines are the biggest thing that you get called on. And I want to spend some time talking about that. It seems like there's going to be some similar applications here between refrigeration and ice machines. But same thing, like what do you see us doing with ice machines, and how can we maintain our ice equipment best to avoid unnecessary breakages?
That's a good question. One of the biggest things that I have seen where has affected my desire to even want to frequent a store is actually related more to food safety. A lot of people do not treat the ice machine as a food source, and it's a food source. And so I have gone into service, do basically preventative maintenance where I descale and sanitize the unit and find, oh man, I have found a sandwich in the bottom of the ice bin. Yeah, in a baggie. And yeah, sandwich.
Wow.
A partially open bottle of soda. I can't remember what it was. It doesn't matter, but partially opened. And I found just things that should not be in the ice bin. And so basically one of the biggest things, because it's an ice, it doesn't kill bacteria. Like that bacteria doesn't die. It stays in the ice. It doesn't grow rapidly. That's one of the blessings of it being in ice. But at the same time, there is a potential of food contamination, foodborne illness from improperly caring for that machine. And every time you open up that ice bin and scoop some ice out, Your hands obviously should be clean. You're not supposed to leave the ice scoop in the bin. At least in our jurisdiction, you're not allowed to do that. They'll ding you on your food safety inspection.
Right, that's a good practice anyway, no matter what.
Yeah. The point I'm making is all of these contaminative interactions with the ice maker create bacteria that does grow at the bottom and plugs up the drain lines. And so following, safe practices with handling food safely is actually helping prevent, biological growth in your drain lines. Because once that water with the bacteria leaves your ice bin, it actually warms up. And in that drain line, where it warms up to, let's just say 50 degrees. I've never taken a temperature of it, but I've always just kind of figured it felt like 50 degrees. Once it starts warming up enough, it will actually, be a nice enough environment for bacteria and yeast to grow. Yeast is a big thing that grows in ice makers. It's that black, boogery looking stuff that you see around the evaporator. Mm-hmm. That's almost impossible to mitigate. You just have to, either not sell beer or make bread or have eaten bread that day, and and then you won't get any yeast in there. But yeast just floats around in our air, and it likes a cold, dark environment, and so it just propagates there. And that's one of the biggest reasons why drain lines will stop up, is because of the yeast formation. And if you do a lot of baking, or if you have a panini press, or you're cutting crust off bread for 3-year-olds or whatever you're doing, you do tend to get a little bit more contamination in the ice. And from what I've been told, that yeast isn't harmful. It's just gross to look at. Because it's the same yeast in there. Now, if you get a big chunk of it in your glass, you might want to let the manager know they need attending. It needs attending to the ice maker. But anyway, that's enough about yeast. But that's the biggest thing for ice makers is drainage and leakage issues, and those are the main reasons why we get all of that yuckiness in there.
Mm. What are the best practices that we can do when we're actually using the ice machine for making drinks to keep it operating in a proper way?
Yeah, that's a good question. The ice machine does one thing, and it makes ice. And so as you are pulling that ice forward, you're basically enabling it to make more ice. And the ice machine doesn't care if it has to make ice or if it doesn't, and if it makes it 3 hours a day or 24 hours a day. As long as you have adequate airflow through the condenser, and the room it's in is going to be the room it's in is adequate temperature within specifications in the installation manual, then you really can't overload the ice maker. It's just going to keep making ice. Mm-hmm. What actually overloads the ice maker is a dirty air filter. Most ice machine manufacturers have air filtration somewhere on the device, whether it's on the back of the condenser. Hoshizaki's on the front. Scotsman has it on the side. Manitowoc has it on the front in the grill. Or on their bigger units, it's in the back. And they all say, all the manufacturers, I think, are in agreement that filter should be cleaned on a weekly basis.
Weekly basis?
Yeah. At least Scotsman for sure says that, and Hoshizaki, I think, is like every 2 weeks. Manitowoc is usually on the back and hard to get to, so that gets cleaned whenever the machine breaks. So,
right.
Those are the things that actually overload an ice machine. So pulling the ice forward is beneficial for small shops that don't have a large enough ice maker for their demand. And if you don't pull the ice forward, what happens is the ice will bind up or catch on the bin full or the ice bin damper and cause it to tell the machine to shut off. And so pulling it forward just gives you a couple more pounds of ice in the machine during your off cycle.
Right. It makes a lot of sense. And I think maybe a lot of people, if they're not doing that with their ice, might think that the unit is not living up to the capacity that they thought it should.
Yeah, for the under-counter ice machines, particularly Manitowoc, that's the brand that I'm predominantly servicing these days. They have like say for example, 260. I think the number is. I might be wrong on that.
Right.
Anyway, it's supposed to make 260 pounds of ice a day. However, the bin only holds about half that. And so if you get a big rush of customers, you might go through that 150 pounds of ice or 100 pounds of ice, depending on what you had in there in the morning, and easily run out of ice. And then your manager or one of your baristas has to run up to the Quickie Mart and go buy a couple bags of ice.
Right. These are all things that we've done multiple times, for sure. I love all of this because it's just one of those things that we don't think of again. And there's so many different little things that we can do, and it becomes just part of how we behave on bar that will prevent these troubles down the line. And with the ice machine, I love that you're talking about hygiene, because like you said, sometimes people just don't treat it like food. They just it's weird, and because of that, I think we also don't really have a lot of respect for refrigeration and ice equipment in the cafe. I don't think, because it's really just the guts of the operation, And for us, we love the espresso machine. It's really flashy, but the refrigeration, we like to polish it sometimes, but outside of that, there's not a lot of substantive things that we feel empowered to do. So I'm really happy to get to talk to you about these things, because it really gives us some things to latch onto and put into practice with our cafes. We were talking about the three major pieces of equipment that we work with in the cafes. Now, the display cases is the last one of those three that I wanted to hit on today. Talk to us a little bit about these units, and what kind of troubles do we get ourselves into, and how can we prevent those troubles?
So if I could back up just a little bit, you were kind of mentioning that oftentimes the refrigeration is kind of neglected. And I was just thinking about a pop culture reference as you were saying that. And it's when Bob Vance introduces himself in the sitcom The Office. And he says, Bob Vance, Vance Refrigeration. And he kind of becomes kind of a joke. But refrigeration is one of those aspects in our culture that wouldn't give us we'd be chasing down rabbits and chickens for our meal if we didn't have any refrigeration. So I do feel like what I do is a pretty important thing, and I try to not just do refrigeration but excel at it and understand all of the factors that go into keeping food safe and keeping businesses running and profitable. And so, I know this is a bit of a side, but I do thank you for letting me have this opportunity.
Well, thank you for doing what you do. Yeah, it keeps us in business, like you said.
So the last piece of equipment that is not as common, but is probably the most visually important in the cafe is either an open case like a grab and go, or a display case of some sorts. And it's very similar to the issues are almost identical that we will have with the display cases as we do with the under counter. You want to have adequate clearance. Usually they have a condenser and pulls air through it, and sometimes those get blocked, sometimes they're neglected. They have a tendency to be a lot more susceptible to environmental issues such as high humidity, sunlight, and just a store running outside of the design specifications. And like I said earlier, about 50 to 60 degrees in indoor humidity with approximately 78 on the high side of the temperature range. Refrigeration really doesn't care if it gets too cold in the store, but your customers do. So we usually don't need to talk too much about the low end of the spectrum. And so One of the issues that I do see with, is particularly during the summer with the display cases, is sweating on the glass. I've had numerous calls for, complaints about this piece of equipment is sweating and it's making puddle on the floor. There was a lady at one of my customers that had slipped and on the water in front of the display case. The sweating aspect is probably one of the biggest areas, and it's one of the areas that I have the least amount of success fixing, typically because of the environmental issues, such as humidity in the store, which is almost exclusively the cause. That really points to the HVAC system. And so, touching on that for just a minute, making sure that you have a well-maintained HVAC system is going to ensure that your refrigeration is going to operate within the specifications it was designed to operate in. And so making sure you have good airflow, making sure if you have an open air case, you don't have too much airflow, because I've had numerous issues with people putting a display case in their store without consideration of where the air is being pushed from with their HVAC. And so numerous times I've had to go in and redirect registers so they're not blowing at the refrigeration or at the display case, and just try to keep the air in front of that piece of equipment as still as possible. And so I'll come in with a smoke pen and just look at what the drafts are. I've got an infrared camera that I use also that will show me where is the heat going and where is it coming from. So some of these tools can really help to fix long-term issues. Not having an open air case is probably the biggest benefit. I know that a lot of store owners don't like to hear that because they do sell a lot of product for it and typically pays for itself, but they are going to be maintenance heavy. So if you want to have one, just know that you're going to have to call your friendly neighborhood refrigeration guy more often than you might want to.
So as we think about all of these things, thinking about the fact that things will break and that some things are going to just require more maintenance than others is a fact of life. It's just things are finite, and just a coffee equipment is the same way. So it's almost like no amount of preventative maintenance will really make your equipment eternal,
Right.
if only. But given that it can extend the life, when we're talking about preventative maintenance, I wonder if you could just quickly give us a rundown on the type of preventative maintenance that most anybody in the cafe can do and how often they should do it on these types of equipment.
Yeah, I like that you asked that, because I'm a big proponent of my customers knowing what their equipment is supposed to do and how they can maintain it so they don't have to see me as often. Because as much as I like the customers and I much like seeing them, they don't always like seeing me as much. So my goal is to help educate anybody that wants to know about how to maintain their equipment. I'm more than happy to do that. I'm not concerned about that hurting my bottom line, so to speak. The biggest thing that store owners can do is almost singularly keep their condensers free of dirt. And that can be done simply by inspecting it visually and brushing off any lint that you see. Some of my customers have gone as far as getting a compressed air, or in some places that serve Cokes and stuff will actually take CO2 from their Coke machine and spray out the condensers with that, just because of the high pressure does do that. If you do that, you want to make sure that you're doing it when the store is not open, because it's going to put a bunch of dust into the air. I usually use a pump sprayer to clean out a condenser. Anytime you are servicing your equipment, you do want to unplug it from the wall. Some things can be damaged if you are trying to service it while it's active, and there's fan blades swinging around in there, and so if you're sticking your fingers in there and all of a sudden it comes on, you can cut yourself. Probably the second thing is, as far as refrigeration goes, you can locate the drain and take a diluted sanitizer solution and pour into the drain on a monthly basis. Some of the drains are hard to find, hard to locate. But if you have a service tech come out, if you ever have the issue, just ask them, hey, show me where I can put a little bit of sanitizing solution just to help inhibit the growth of bacteria and stuff in the drain lines. Because at the end of the drain line, I didn't mention this earlier, at the end of the drain line on many pieces of equipment, there's a trap. And what that does is to prevent air from infiltrating back into the system from the hot environment below. So it's just basically to make it, it's just a trap to prevent airflow where it's not supposed to flow. So, and that's usually where all of that garbage will gather. And then any manager, anybody that opens the door can identify what a ripped gasket looks like. Most gaskets can be readily ordered online from various sites. Most manufacturers now, you don't need to go through a distributor. It's easy to change a gasket. It's they basically just pull out and push right back in. They just got a little wedge dart shape, and as soon as those are in, then you're good to go.
Something you mentioned earlier in this conversation was that a lot of these things are outlined in the manuals of the equipment.
Absolutely.
And how foreign this is to a lot of us is, I think, what prevents a lot of us from doing anything about it. Like taking a gasket out of a fridge. There's like this, I don't know, I don't want to break the fridge. And then what happens if I don't know how to put it back in? But it seems like these types of things are made to be easy, and that's why they're outlined in the manual, because they expect people to do them.
Yes. So the installation manual and the operation manuals are good pieces of the literature, oftentimes overlooked. Ice makers especially come with a pretty good operation manual, and many of the manufacturers actually have all the instructions for maintaining the ice maker and a simple list of fault codes on their, basically the cover. And so, plus a lot of the manufacturers with the knowledge base that is available on the web, most manufacturers have put not only service manuals, or not only the installation and the operation, but also service manuals available for the public online. And those are golden because they will literally walk you through any issue that you can have. Manitowoc has great service manuals. They have written it basically so a fourth grader can fix an ice maker as long as they know how to use a torch. And I'm not promoting people to go get a torch set and start fixing their ice maker.
Or make your fourth grader do it.
Or make your fourth grader do it. Yeah, maybe wait till fifth grade. Commercial refrigeration, particularly in the cafe setting when you're dealing with reach-in equipment, it's not rocket surgery. There is a lot of things that you can do that can keep your equipment basically maintenance-free for up to 10 years. Most manufacturers have a 3 years parts and labor warranty. And so if it's within that period, I recommend you actually just call a service company or call the manufacturer, and they'll send out their local rep for that equipment, because that's going to ensure that like if there's a repair or something done, it's going to be on that company versus having one of your guys try to fix it. Now, the things that are outlined in the operator's manual that you're supposed to be doing on interval, then if you call up the tech and the refrigerator's not running and it was a sweater over the condenser, then you'll be charged for that. So understanding the operator manual and understanding when it's a issue that you can fix and when you can't is good to know. But yeah, take advantage of the knowledge base that's out there. If you have a good relationship with your refrigeration guy, or your HVAC guy, I would recommend that you just say, hey, I would like to try to maintain this myself. What are some pointers you can give? Can you show me this and that on that? And be willing to pay them for the time if they're going to, help you maintain it, and they're going to educate you on how to do it without hurting yourself or hurting the equipment, then, that's worth, whatever they want to charge you, I guess. There's just a lot of things, and it really is just, it's just understanding that there is risk involved, but not being afraid to take a calculated risk.
Well, I really wholeheartedly endorse that, asking your local tech and exploring, and I love the approach you're taking to all of this, and the fact that we got to talk to you for this hour about the tech for free. And it's very generous of you to spend your time talking to us on the show today to help us with our equipment and get a better understanding of some of the things that we can do better in. We're really all about creating a solid operation in the shop, and this is definitely going a long way to helping us accomplish that. So thanks very much, Luke. This was really awesome.
Yeah, well, thank you again. Like I said, this was a terrific opportunity for me to talk about something I love doing. Thank you.
Well, I really appreciate this episode because there are so many things in the cafe that get overlooked, and this is one of them, and it's one of the most costly outside of your coffee equipment. And I feel like a lot of us feel powerless to do anything about it. We're always at the mercy of the refrigeration and the ice machine and things like that. Most of the time, in my experience, and it seems like in Luke's experiences as well, it has to do with just kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's working today, and that'll work tomorrow, and the preventative maintenance doesn't get done, and then we pay for it. So I love that we spent some time talking about this on the show, giving some pointers on how to best approach the equipment and performing the preventative maintenance on it. The importance of focusing on these pieces of equipment cannot be overstated, and I really appreciate Luke coming on the show with us today. Now, if you want to learn more about Luke and what he does in the maintenance department, you can go to his website, themaintenancedepartment.com. I have his website linked up in the show notes here, and if you are outside of the scope of Luke's service area, which I know is most of you in this audience, like Luke suggested, reach out to the service tech in your area that you most trust and really make them a part of the team. Bring them in, like Luke said, and have them teach you the best practices for the equipment that you have, and that's really going to pay off in the long run. Now, if you want to reach out to me, you can do so by emailing chris@keystotheshop.com with all of your questions, feedback, comments about the show, or if you want to reach out and ask about working with Keys to the Shop Consulting. I'm available to help you over the phone in coaching, or to go to your location and help you assess your operations, train your people, and help you build a great coffee business. Again, that's chris@keystotheshop.com. Well, that's it for today's show. Thank you so much again for joining me and learning a little bit about the do's and don'ts of refrigeration. I hope that you take this information and apply it in your cafe and have an awesome week. And as always, I hope that this episode has truly given you keys to the shop.